Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Putin. Putin is one of those characters we love to hate. Vladimir Putin is obnoxious. He never apologizes. He acts to preserve Russian interests without concern for blowback. He does not care about international media optics. The recent announcement that Russia is pulling out of Syria is a perfect example of Putinism. The announcement was the media equivalent of a massive tsunami. No one expected it to happen, and it caused a tidal wave of incredulity around the world. But in reality, Russia isn't pulling out of Syria. Russia's pullout in Syria is not at all what we envision when we hear the words military pullout. Putin is the exact opposite of Barack Obama. Obama is still considering and wavering about what to do in Syria. Putin determined what was needed and did it. He's now moving on to the next stage, and that will allow him to achieve his larger objectives. The United States, meanwhile, is still trying to figure out what their goals are. Russia is only pulling out on the ground. If Russia's ground forces stay in Syria too long, they will take casualties, and that's hard to sell at home. Even worse is Russia's foreign forces on the ground could become a unifying, motivating power, a factor for other local groups involved in the quagmire called Syria. Take a look at who and what Putin is leaving in place in Syria. Seeing the list makes his next move crystal clear. Putin is keeping total control of their port in Tartus. Russia invested $3 to $4 billion in creating that naval port in Tartus, and they have turned it into their naval headquarters in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. From Tartus, Russia can listen and control all of their assets and their forces as they roam throughout the region. They can listen to almost everything that happens with everyone else throughout the entire Middle East. Tartus is a huge strategic asset for Russia. Creating the port was one of Putin's major goals from the very beginning of his Syrian operation. Putin is also keeping their newly built Russian Air Force bases in Latakia and Hayamim. Each of these bases house dozens of fighter jets, that is. When you add those jets to the 30 and 40 jets on the Russian aircraft carrier, which is off the coast of Tartus and then comes back and forth regularly, the number of Russian fighter jets around Syria reaches 70 to 75. This may be a reduction, but it's hardly a withdrawal. Soon after the announcement was made, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry in Amman, Jordan. The focus of their meeting was the ceasefire in Syria. But in reality, it was just a bone the Russians threw to placate the United States, which feels that it is out of the loop. Then, the next Wednesday, Kerry and Lavrov spoke on the phone. Finally, the next week, Kerry visited Moscow. Russia is just going through the motions of keeping the United States informed. Putin has been keeping Bashar Assad of Syria in power. With Assad in power, by virtue of Putin's assistance, Putin could build his infrastructure. Russia does not feel that Assad on his own has the power to stay, but they need Assad in place, and they will keep him there until a better situation emerges. That better situation may very likely be splitting the country into cantons or federations. A canton for the Kurds, a canton for the Alawites, which is Assad's clan, a canton for Hezbollah on the Golan Heights, a canton for the Sunnis. All that might happen. Russia does not want either ISIS or Al-Qaeda to take control of the Sunni canton. The Islamists are too explosive, too unpredictable. Russia also wants Iran to send back their Revolutionary Guards, and they want Hezbollah to resume their role in confronting ISIS and al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda group in Syria. Let Hezbollah and Iran do some of the heavy lifting, Russia is saying. This transition will allow Putin to continue to exercise control over Syria with far less risk. He will continue to use his air force and continue to attack all those who challenge Russian assets. Russians will not endanger their own special forces on the ground anymore. For now, Russia has achieved its goals. They have built a real and permanent presence in the region. They do not need Assad. They want regional control. Vladimir Putin is in constant communication with Israel, assuring Netanyahu that the security of Israel is a priority. Israeli President Rivlin was visiting Moscow and discussing with Russia the agenda that they have. And Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was also invited to Moscow to continue the conversation. Assad, for his part, will beg Hezbollah and Iran to increase their forces in the country. But in the end, with or without Assad, no one will unseat Russia from their new stronghold in Syria. So yes, Russia is scaling down in Syria, but what they're really doing is securing their assets and saying, let everyone else battle it out while we move into our new status and watch and monitor everything in the region. Securing a presence in Syria for the specific purpose of monitoring the Middle East was Putin's plan from the very beginning. He was never interested in propping up Assad and keeping peace or reducing deaths of innocents. His real goal was to establish Russia as an international power and the game that he's involved in. Unfortunately, most of the world, especially the United States, never saw it coming. That's a good reason people love to hate Putin. On another subject, the intel was there, but the intel apparently went unheeded. Haaretz, one of Israel's daily newspapers of record, reported that Belgian and other intelligence agencies had specific threat warnings about the terror attacks that rocked Brussels on March 22nd, claiming the lives of 35 innocent victims and wounding over 200 others. The simultaneous triple bombing attacks that took place 6 miles apart from each other, 2 at the airport in Brussels and 1 at the downtown train station, should not have happened. Haaretz said that the intelligence agencies had specific warnings about an attack that would take place at the train station. Anyone in the world of intelligence knows that intel of that type should automatically be extrapolated to include airports as well. When Salim Absalem, the terrorist leader responsible for the Paris bombings, was interrogated following his capture and arrest in Brussels 4 days before the bombing of Brussels, he bragged about the other terrorist cells that he had created. He was arrogant and confident enough to talk about how these cells were prepared and poised to strike. Murdering 130 people in Paris wasn't enough for him. He planned more. Truthfully, we did not need Absalem's confirmation to know that ISIS was planning more attacks. Of course ISIS wants to hit with more awful and deadly attacks, but unfortunately, the powers in charge ignored the warnings. And now, intelligence is saying that 400 trained ISIS people are scattered in various cells throughout Europe, planning attacks and scouting their targets. Living in the West, we have a difficult time understanding suicide bombers. We cannot fathom what possesses a young man or woman to take his own life in order to murder as many innocent bystanders as possible. The answer is more nuanced than we would like to hear. The answer is not only Islamic extremism, but it's also a tiny sliver of a bigger picture. Remember this: Islam forbids alcohol, and yet Absalem and his brother, who blew himself up in Paris in the Paris bombings, they were partners in a bar, and that bar was a haven for boozing, drug-loving Muslim teens. In that bar, they watched videos of ISIS on the big screen like we watch sports, and they organized petty crimes as well as terror attacks. Not dissimilar from the Paris attack, the terror in Belgium, in Brussels, was perpetrated by 2 brothers. Their names were Khalid and Ibrahim el-Barouki, and they were known to security officials as potential threats. One brother was actually expelled from Turkey and sent back to Belgium. The Turkish President Erdogan announced that fact. When he arrived in Brussels, the authorities interviewing him believed him when he said that the charges against him were all a lie, and they let him go. Knowing the MO of these brothers and receiving the terror warning should have set off the bells and whistles alerting authorities to the attack that was to be perpetrated and could have been avoided. There is more pertinent information that was ignored by the Belgian authorities. Ever since the 1970s, when the Palestinian terrorists attacked Jewish and Israeli tourists in Belgium and hijacked Sabena, the Belgian national airline, in response, Israel gave Belgium important tactical plans to beef up their security. If those plans had been in place, it is unlikely that the attack would have been successful. When terrorists simultaneously blew up trains in Madrid, Spain, in 2004, security on trains and in train stations should have been upgraded around the world, especially in Europe. It should not have been up to 2 alert vacationing U.S. Marines to foil an attack last summer when ISIS attempted to blow up a train traveling from France to Belgium. And why wasn't security worldwide upgraded then? Were leaders in security hoping the threat would disappear? Wishful and hopeful thinking does not thwart terror. The Israeli concept of security at sites like airports and train stations and bus stations is called the layered approach. The defense system is set up to catch unusual threats at the outer periphery. If what or who is not caught in the outermost layer, it's caught within the layers inside that. That means surveying and checking people and their possessions even before they enter the terminal. It's not good enough to simply have security screening, a station, let's say, for instance, for people boarding, those with boarding passes going through the gates. This security screening only protects the planes. The major danger is obviously in the entrance hall. It's unthinkable that anyone, just anyone, can hop into a cab with bombs in their bags and enter an airport to blow themselves up. Scanning passengers with boarding passes really protects the airplanes. It does not protect the passengers in the hall. Israel has taken airport and terminal security to the nth degree. They have access to the IDs of passengers before they even arrive at the airport. They have an outer perimeter on the road, which is the first screening layer. And then they have numerous other layers outside the terminal. Anyone suspicious or acting suspiciously is stopped and moved away from the crowds. Inside the terminal, there is also security. There's screening, there are cameras, they're watching all kinds of things. And once again, they're watching for suspicious behavior. The Brussels terror attack was a terrible tragedy. Knowing now that the pieces were there and ignored makes it even more tragic. It was a failure by Belgian security and by those charged with protecting their nation. They should all resign, and then they should be investigated and prosecuted. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column. Actually, I only want to do one column today. We're going to spend a lot of time on the cartoons section, so we'll look at one important piece today. In sticking with the theme of the show, so we're going to continue to analyze the terror that rocked Brussels, and by extension, all of Europe. This column actually comes from a European paper, The Scotsman. The Scotsman is the paper of record in Scotland. This piece is by a character named Chris Marshall and was published March 27th, 2016. It's entitled, Counterterrorism Chief Nicholson Fears Homegrown Attack. The subtitle is, It was an attack designed not only to kill, but to create panic and fear across Europe. Marshall is one of their major writers and columnists. He writes about foreign affairs and education and local politics. I guess you could say that he writes about everything. The essence of the column is that Scotland is at risk, but those in charge believe that the risk is lower because access to firearms is more difficult. The police officers' organization thinks they are woefully understaffed. But the good news is that the author believes that the real trick to making certain that Scotland stays safe is communal relations. And the challenge is to make certain communal relations not into some trick, but into real interaction, because the community can really help stop terror. Here's how Marshall begins. In targeting Brussels Airport and the metro station close to European Union offices, brothers Khalid and Ibrahim el-Barouki and their accomplices did not care for the religion or nationality of their victims, only that they would probably be drawn from the international community. And as the full horror of Tuesday's attacks began to emerge, so too did another depressingly familiar feature of recent atrocities on European soil. Those responsible for the slaughter of 31 innocent civilians and the maiming of scores more were themselves Belgian nationals, raised in Europe, but inspired by the rancorous ideology of a group calling itself Islamic State. In the hours that followed the twin bombings of Zaventem Airport and Malbeek metro station, security was being tightened across the UK. Then Marshall brings the official public police comments about the terror risks. He says that there's not much of a chance that attacks like Paris and Brussels could possibly happen in Scotland. Listen to what he says. Quote, but speaking to Scotland on Sunday, Assistant Chief Constable Roydich Nicholson, who is responsible for counter-terrorism, said the nature of any attack was unlikely to be as sophisticated as those in Paris last year due to the relative difficulty of obtaining firearms. Asked about where the threat would come from, Nicholson said it's going to be from people who are already in the country. That's likely not to be the kind of firearms capability we've seen in Paris because we believe the profile of firearms in Scotland is much lower. It's much more likely to be an unsophisticated attack. Marshall then explains, but there is evidence to the contrary. A local imam praised a Muslim in Pakistan who was sentenced to death for murder. The murdered man was an Islamic extremist, and the Scottish imam called the murderer a true Muslim. That was a real problem. Also, there are probably about 800 Brits who have traveled to Syria to join ISIS. No one knows how many Scots are in that number, but it is safe to say that there are at least two. One was killed by the Allies just after making a recruitment video, and one was a 16-year-old girl. Finally, Marshall explains his point of view on community relations. He quotes the police and their leadership. Quote, communities themselves will prevent terrorism, said Nicholson. That's going to be much more important than anything the police can do. To some extent, by the time the police are involved, it's too late. Despite police confidence in community relations, there has been criticism of some of the tactics employed to stop radicalization, most notably in the UK's government preventive strategy. Richard Haley, chair of civil liberties group Scotland Against Criminalising Communities, said, the police need to build genuine relations with the community, not relations that are driven by flawed theories about radicalization. They shouldn't be seeking to build links for that purpose, but to build links because that's what good policing is about. There's a danger the discourse around radicalization is influencing the whole relationship between the police and the Muslim community. The purpose of bringing this column to you is to show that communities all over Europe are struggling with this curse called terror. Scotland is closer to the heart of the matter right now than we are in the United States. Yet, they also confront the same issues that many of our communities confront, and they suffer from the same mistaken delusions. I am certain that Belgians said the same thing about community relations and gun access. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. All the cartoons today focus on the terror in Brussels. They come from social media and can be divided into several themes. The first theme surrounds the symbol of Brussels. The symbol of Brussels is a little boy pissing. It's actually a fountain. The city is built around this very small statue in the corner cutout of a block, only minutes walk from the train station that was bombed. The statue is called Mannequin Piss. The story goes that Brussels was surrounded and about to be conquered. The cannon of the enemy was lit and about to be fired, which would destroy the city, when the little boy urinated on the wick, dousing the cannon and saving the city. The next four cartoons use this motif. The first is Mannequin Piss, he's in red, on black background, urinating on an AK-47 rifle, the weapon most preferred by terrorists. The red baby is obviously symbolic of blood. The black is the darkness of terror, and the baby is Brussels putting out or defeating terror. The next cartoon is much more humorous. This scene has Mannequin Piss urinating all over the terrorist. It seems like he's smiling as he's urinating all over him. The next cartoon depicts Mannequin in the statue mold. And so the terrorist is actually in the place where Mannequin normally is placed, and Mannequin has a Belgian flag in his mouth, and he's urinating over the terrorist from the side on top going down, the terrorist is seeking to hide inside the fountain itself. Moving to another cartoon of the same genre is depicting Mannequin pissed in a slightly different way. This cartoon, is drawn totally in a line, just a single line, very simple angelic figure. Mannequin here is just urinating on the word terrorism, which of course is spelled in French with an E at the end. Now we get to a variation of the theme. This cartoon uses the character named Tintin. Tintin is the iconic comic child from Belgium who actually play acts that he's a detective. He's the American equivalent of Dennis the Menace in many ways, but instead of getting into trouble, he gets out of trouble. In this cartoon, Tintin is reading the paper, and it says, "My God." The paper's headline reads, "Explosions in Brussels." Then there's an article in the headline which just reads, "Dead." These are the only words that can be seen on the page. Using the motif again of child, the image of the child of the mannequin, and now the children's comic strip character, Tintin, shows that there's no doubt that these cartoons are reflective of Brussels and Belgium today. There were dozens of cartoons depicting the next theme. It's the theme of the Belgian flag. This cartoon has the Belgian flag and the French flag, each draped around a symbolic person. They're sharing grief. Underneath each is the date of the horrifying attack that shook those societies and binds them together. Under the French flag, it reads November 13th. Under the Belgian flag, it reads March 22nd. This next cartoon is a heart. It has colors of the Belgian flag, but it's all splattered. The splatter actually looks like blood, especially the red. This heart is, of course, the flag of Belgium. And finally, there were many cartoons that just started takeoff on Je suis Charlie. That is, I'm Charlie, from the ISIS attacks on Charlie Hebdo last year. There are many varieties to choose from, but I just chose one very simple, straightforward one that I think is poignant. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. In October, 2 Palestinian terrorists murdered 3 Israelis. One of the terrorists, Micah Halpern, was a graphic designer. It took Time magazine until now, 5 months later, and much pressure and international shame, before they finally corrected the dots in the story itself. Originally, on October 15th, Time magazine ran a story entitled "The Desperation Driving Young Palestinians to Violence," which simply referred to Micah Halpern as a graphic designer who was killed by Israeli security forces after allegedly trying to carry out an attack in Jerusalem, unquote. The piece totally ignored the fact that the graphic designer was a mass murderer and that he was killed after killing 3 Israelis and would have, if permitted, killed many more. Halpern and his accomplice overtook a bus in Jerusalem. They stabbed and shot and continued to shoot and stab. The terrorist, aka the graphic artist, locked the bus door, not letting anyone escape and preventing defense teams from boarding. The terrorist was killed when an Israeli anti-terror team shot him from outside the bus. The important part is not that he was a graphic artist. No. He murdered 3 innocent people by taking over a public bus in Jerusalem. Only now, 5 months later, after being shamed into clarifying their original story, Time magazine finally made the correction. One that fell far short of an apology. In Time's words, they added a component to the website and the story, quote, "to give fuller account of the attack," unquote. That was why they did it. Think about it. 5 months needed to pass to get to the truth. A little something about Iraq. Firebase Bell is a secret U.S. Special Forces base in northern Iraq. The U.S. base came under rocket attack recently by ISIS. 2 days earlier, another attack had killed a U.S. Marine at that base. Staff Sergeant Lewis Carden is a Marine who was killed by an ISIS rocket that struck the base. The number of injured during the attack has still not been released. We do know, however, that the company at the base is composed of a little less than 200 soldiers. ISIS discovered the U.S. base and figured that they could hit it from a distance by launching rockets into the camp. That maneuver was so successful that ISIS returned 2 days later and did it again. This is a major flaw in U.S. security. ISIS rocket launchers and shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapons are easy to carry, but the United States needs to prevent ISIS from getting close enough to shoot at their base. If the United States does not make this correction, ISIS will continue to shoot at them day after day, damaging the base and putting the lives of the military stationed at Firebase Bell at risk. Ynet News reports that an Israeli company called Celebrite is the third party helping the FBI crack the encryption on the iPhone 5C that belonged to one of the San Bernardino terrorists, the phone that Apple is refusing to unlock even after federal judges demanded their help. There's been much discussion about how to break the codes on the cell phones, and the chat forums are filled with ideas. Celebrite, which is headquartered in Petah Tikva, has been on contract to the FBI and the Justice Department since 2013. One of the services they provide is cracking encryption codes by means of software that they developed themselves. Celebrite has also been known to strong-arm and break individual codes. Another part of their business is data backup and diagnostics. They can run retrieving programs on 15,000 different kinds of cell phone models. The Israeli company provides this service to over 90 countries. Most of their subscribers are intelligence agencies, security agencies, armies, and governments. The company has been able to solve crimes perpetrated around the world by getting information off phones that supposedly had been wiped clean. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. We spoke about being sorry regarding Putin and Time magazine. The word sorry in English comes from an Old English and Middle Dutch language base. Their word was sarig, to feel sorry because of pain inflicted. Actually, it's based on the word for pain. Did you know that in Hebrew there are many words for being sorry? Slicha is the first word we learn, actually, when we come to that. Then there's mitzta'er. Then there's lihishtacharit, or charata, as we call it. But finally, there's tshuva, which really means to repent. It really actually means to return to the root, to return to your original path. It comes from the root shuv. Most often we associate the term with the high holidays, but not so. The rabbis insist that we always evaluate our actions and we return to the proper behavior and correct the mistakes that we make. Of course, Maimonides, the Rambam as we call him, was influenced by Aristotle, and he refers to this idea as following the right path, the golden mean. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.